Chanukah Sameach. I hope everyone is enjoying this wonderful holiday. It's really my honor to say a few words on behalf of a wonderful organization that I have the privilege of teaching every week, and that is Yiboneh, under the leadership of Rabbi Aaron Poston. Yiboneh is a multifaceted organization that not only offers classes, shiurim, guest lectures of very high quality, but also involves community members in acts of loving kindness. Chazal tell us the world stands on three pillars: Torah, the study of Torah; divine service, prayer; gemilas chasadim, acts of loving kindness. Yiboneh is trying to establish pillars that are connected to all three of these foundations. And in this way, many people who have not always found their religious home in Jerusalem have found their home here, have connected here, whether it's a Pesach Seder, whether it's a Shir, whether it's a guest lecture, whether it's a Tu B'Shvat Seder or a Purim Suda. Yiboneh has become the go-to address for people who are seeking a stronger connection to Judaism, coupled with social activism and a connection to the needs of the less fortunate. We're talking during the holiday of Chanukah. Chanukah is the holiday of light. We know that, of course, the Torah itself is compared to light. The verse says in Proverbs, Ki ner mitzvah v'Torah or, a mitzvah is a candle that pierces the darkness, and the Torah is the light that dispels the darkness. And as a result, it's become customary. There's a very old custom in Klal Yisrael that particularly on Chanukah, which celebrates the triumph of the light over the darkness, we try to contribute and support the learning of Torah and Jewish education, because that is bringing light to the world, which is otherwise shrouded in darkness. So I would appeal to everybody to examine Yiboneh, look at the good work that it's doing, and please support it as generously as you can. I can assure you that your money will be doing a great mitzvah, will be helping a lot of people, and will help to bring light into a world that is shrouded in darkness. Thank you, and Chanukah Sameach. And welcome, and hope everyone is staying healthy. And once again, the shir tonight is dedicated for the Refuah Shelema of Binyamin Yisroel ben Chanita, who should have a Refuah Shelema. He's going through a difficult time, and it should be B'toch Shar Chole Yisrael, and all of our learning should be for Refuah Shelema for him, and for the Chole Yisrael, and for all of Klal Yisrael in the world, that they should not get sick, and they should remain healthy. In just a few days, we'll be celebrating the great holiday of Chanukah, and those of you from the United States may remember that every year there is something, again, it's not so much a phenomenon in Israel, but in America it's a big deal, where something that's called the December dilemma is discussed, because it happens to be that our holiday of Chanukah is in close proximity to a major holiday in the Christian world, and people are debating, particularly in the Reform movement, whether Chanukah should be built up to be like Christmas, lahavdil, or whether we should de-emphasize Chanukah, because Chanukah is not a complete Yom Tov. And this is the December dilemma. In fact, one of the reasons why there's so much gift giving on Chanukah is they want to compete with the non-Jewish holiday. And what I want to say tonight is that for Jews who are very involved in Torah and mitzvos, there is no dilemma here. We recognize that Chanukah is not a Chag, Chanukah is not a Yom Tov, in the sense that you're allowed to do work, you're allowed to do malacha, except perhaps while the candles themselves are burning. But I think, I've just talked about this and I'll talk about it again tonight, Chanukah is an extremely important Yom Tov for what it tells the Jew in the 21st century, particularly in Western countries. And it's a tremendously important message. It's a message of hope. It's a message of standing up for your principles. It's a message of confronting the darkness of the world, even when it appears hopeless, because then God will bless your efforts beyond what you thought possible. And it really reminds us, in a world of assimilation, in a world of decadence, in a world of corruption, if people have the courage to make moral choices, to make good choices, to do the right thing, then they will be pleasantly surprised how far that influence will go. And that's really our message. You know, Chazal teach us, based on the book of Daniel, Sefer Daniel, that there are 4 exiles that the Jewish people will undergo. until the coming of Mashiach. The first exile is the exile of Babylonia, Babel, that destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. The second exile was the exile under Persia, because the Persian Empire conquered Babylonia. And of course, during that duration is the story of Purim and Haman. The third exile is called the exile of Greece. That's when Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire. That's the famous Peloponnesian War, which is written about by the famed Greek historian Thucydides. And that is really the war of Greece against Persia. And in that long reign of Yavan is Antiochus and the story of Chanukah. And then, finally, we have the Galus of Edom, the Galus of Rome. Rome eventually, well, what happened was, after the Chanukah story, as you know, the Hasmoneans established an independent Jewish state that lasted for around 120 years. But eventually that fell apart by the Romans conquering. The Romans destroyed the Second Temple in the year 70, and since the temple has not been rebuilt, we are still considered to be in the exile of Rome. So our four Goliot, our four exiles, are Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And even though there is no Roman Empire, we are still in the Roman exile. And again, there are several reasons why we still describe ourselves in the Galus of Edom. Reason number one, the Beis HaMikdash that they destroyed has not yet been rebuilt, even if they're gone, but the Galus that they perpetrated is still around. Number two, Rome is essentially the transmitter of Western civilization in terms of alphabet, in terms of legal principles. And number three, Rome became the seat of Christianity. In fact, the Roman Empire under Constantine officially adopted Christianity as a religion. And since the fate of Jews in Western worlds has been so bound up with the Christian Church, particularly the Catholic Church, in a sense, when we are subjugated to either the political power or the spiritual influence of the Catholic Church, we are suffering the Galut of Edom, not because Esav was a Christian, obviously he was not, but because the Romans, who are descended from the Edomites, adopted Christianity, and Christianity continued to have a major influence well beyond the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 of the Common Era. Now, the Ibn Ezra raises a very interesting question. So the Ibn Ezra asks the question that both in the book of Daniel and in the Midrashim of Chazal, they only speak of the four exiles, with the last exile being the exile of Edom. And by the way, let me digress for a moment. The song that all of us sing after the Chanukah lighting in menorah, the famous song Ma'oz Sur. Ma'oz Sur, I hope you realize, and if you look at a translation, you will see this immediately, is all about the four exiles. Meaning, it spells out in acrostic. The first letter of each stanza spells out the name Mordechai. This is not the Mordechai of Purim. This is the otherwise anonymous author of this great song, which, by the way, has a beautiful, intricate rhyming structure. If you look at the A, B, B, A, B, etc., that's a very good rhyming structure. But again, just for your edification, let me just go over it very, very quickly. The first stanza is simply saying that God has redeemed us from our enemies and will redeem us from our enemies. And when that happens, we will give God a song of thanksgiving. So we'll call that generic. That is the generic praise to Hashem for all the redemptions that He has given us and all the redemptions He will give us. And for that we give Todah. Ad oz yashir b'shir mizmor Chanukah HaMizbeach. I will sing with a joyous song celebrating the dedication of the altar of the Mizbeach. The second stanza is about Yetziat Mitzrayim, God taking us out of Egypt, which is really a precursor to the four exiles. The four exiles are after we got to Eretz Yisrael. Then you have Babylon, Persia, Yavan, and Esav. Mitzrayim is the pre-Golus, so to speak, that set the pattern. Stanza number 3 is about Babylonia. Stanza number 4 is about Persia. It mentions Haman. Stanza number 5 is the only one that's about Chanukah, and that's Yevanim nikbatsu alai, the Greeks gathered against me, and that's the story of Chanukah. That's why that stanza is often sung separately as a separate standalone nigun, because that's a Chanukah song. The rest of it is about all the other Goliaths. And stanza number 6 is praying that just as God has redeemed us from Babylonia, Persia, and Greece, may God redeem us from the evil empire of Rome. And that stanza, you could imagine, was heavily censored by the Catholic Church over many centuries, and that's why different Siddurim sometimes tone it down. So for example, in the original stanza, which many Siddurim have restored, Edom is described as Uma Harisha'a, the evil empire, a phrase that Ronald Reagan used about the old Soviet Union, which by the way is also red. Edom is red. There's also a connection with Russia and communism, the Greek Orthodox Church, etc. But some Siddurim tone it down, and that really is a result of censorship. So you might be singing Mo's Sur from different Siddurim, and when you get to the last stanza, you'll be saying different words. But the Eben Ezra's question is still a good question, because Mo's Sur, the book of Daniel, the Midrashim of Chazal, only talk about Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Edom, and they don't talk about the Islamic empires, which are descended largely from Ishmael. Right? The Arab nations are descended from Ishmael. And in the Eben Ezra's time, which is already the 11th century, the Islamic empires were a world empire. And even today, while Ishmael may not control necessarily a lot of territory, they do have a stranglehold on the world in terms of oil, in terms of terrorism. Islamic fundamentalism is affecting countries all over the place. How can that be ignored in the description of the 4 Goliaths? Now, historically, the answer would be very simple, that Chazal wrote the Midrashim before Muhammad, so there was no Islam when they wrote. But nevertheless, we know that the book of Daniel, by definition, is prophetic, so why is there no reference to Ishmael in the book of Daniel? It's a very, very interesting question, and indeed, Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is a medrash, a late medrash, actually writes that in spite of the idea that we always talk about the 4 Goliaths, there will be a 5th Golus before Mashiach comes, and that will be the most difficult Golus of all. That will be the Galut of Yishmael. But we don't treat it like a separate Galut, because the Galut of Yishmael will be a simultaneous augmentation of the persecutions of Galut Edom. And thus we find that most Jews of the world are living in Western countries. So most Jews are living under the influence of Christianity, but they are persecuted, so to speak, indirectly by Ishmael. So Ishmael is not a standalone Golus. Ishmael is like a parasitic, demonic force that attaches itself to the Golus of Edom. And I think I may have mentioned an amazing comment of the Maharal of Prague, who wrote this in the 1500s, that he says, B'acharit hayamim, in the end of days, the Galut of Yishmael will reconnect not only to Edom. With Edom, it's antagonistic, meaning the relationship of Islamic culture to Western civilization is one of antagonism. Western civilization are infidels, heretics. But the Maharal says that Bnei Yishmael will attach in a peaceful way to Persia, back to Paras. And Paras signifies genocide. And there will be an unholy alliance between Yishmael and Paras directed against the Jewish people. Now this is a phenomenally amazing and frightening observation, because Paras is Persia. Persia is Iran. Now Iran, it's important to know this, Iran is an Islamic country, but Iran is not an Arabic country. Okay, there are Arabs who are Muslims and there are Arabs who are Christians, but most Arabs are Muslims. Iran is not connected to Ishmael directly. The Iranians are actually descended, at least to some degree, from the ancient Persians. So when Arab nations make peace treaties with Iran in order to foster terrorism, this is mamash what the Maral is saying, the alliance between the Bnei Ishmael and the Bnei Paras to destroy the Jewish people. Very, very frightening. Right? So in effect, therefore, we are in a Golus Yishmael, which is superimposed on the Golut of Edom. And the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer says that the Golut of Yishmael will be the most difficult Golut because Yishmael has spiritual merit in their name, the name of God. Yishmael has the merit of Brit Milah. Yishmael has the merit of prayer 5 times a day. Yishmael has the merit of modesty. And therefore, even though they have evil motivations, even though they're trying to destroy us, they have a certain power that is greater than the power of Esav. Esav, Edom, comes with physical might. Bnei Yishmael come with a certain spiritual koach. And because they come with a certain spiritual koach, they can be defeated only by spiritual means, not exclusively by military or political means. Okay, so this is the Golus of Yishmael that is superimposed on top of the Golus of Edom. I think I had mentioned a few weeks ago that in effect, Yishmael versus Edom is also a struggle that is replicated within our own personalities. Because Edom has become the ethic of hedonistic materialism. Just like Esav said when he sold the birthright. Behold, I'm going to die. Why do I need a birthright? Meaning, Esav is saying, all there is this world. Eat, drink, and be merry. For tomorrow you will die. So Esav represents that force in the world. The hedonistic culture of do your own thing, live for the moment. Live for power, live for money, live for pleasure. And that's the koach of Esav. Yishmael is the other way around. Yishmael represents a certain religious fanaticism that expresses itself in destruction. So there are two very opposite types of threats. The threat of Esav comes from assimilation, hedonism. The threat of Yishmael comes from a religious fanaticism. So, within my own personality, if I decide to sleep late and not go to Shachris, that's the Esav in me that's talking. If I decide to denigrate other Jews that they're not religious enough for me, that's the Ishmael in me that's talking. And in many ways, there is a concept, particularly in Sifrei Chasidus, that if you want to eradicate the Esavs and the Ishmaels out there, if you want to be protected from those forces out there, you have to eradicate those forces within ourselves. So we eradicate the Esav by becoming more passionate and committed in our mitzvot. We eradicate the Ishmael by becoming tolerant, generous, compassionate, and accepting of people, and not sitting in judgment on them. Now that's a difficult balance, because you'll often find that the more passionate you become in your religion, the less tolerant and accepting you can be of other people who are not living up to your standards. And the other way you find as well. When I'm an accepting person, I'm okay, you're okay, I believe in the big tent of Judaism, I believe that all ideas are legitimate. That tends to mean you're very lukewarm in your own religious fervor. So it's a very, very difficult balance to be strong and passionate and connected to halacha, to Judaism, to Torah, and at the same time look at people with a generosity of spirit and a kindness and an understanding that different people are moving at different rates. Different people discover truth in different ways. And we should get out of the business of labeling people as apikorsim, heretics, kofrim. You know, the old joke that I think I've said probably many, many times, and other people have said many times. We often have the attitude that anyone to the right of me is a fanatic, and anyone to the left of me is an apikoros, a heretic. And wherever I am is right, is correct, I should say, but the what I am gets narrower and narrower and narrower. I mean, at some point, you're going to find, particularly in Eretz Yisrael, you're going to find that the gradations between what's a heretic and what's acceptable, or what's a fanatic and what's acceptable, are paper thin, are laser thin, because the difference between this side and that side is almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Okay, so I'm bringing this in because the concept of the 4 exiles is a very important introduction to the story of Chanukah. Now I want to make 2 more points and then I'll get directly into Chanukah. And that is, the Medrash tells us that the 4 exiles are alluded to in really the very second verse of the Torah. They were built into the fabric of creation. It says, in the beginning God made heaven and earth, and what's in the second verse? Ha'aretz, ha'isa, soihu, vavayhu, v'choshech, al pnei tahom. The earth, or the universe, was tayu. Tayu means astonishingly empty. Vayu, a confused jumble. Now already you can see that we're in big trouble here, because if something is totally empty, how can it be a jumble? The answer is we don't know. But look at the 2 things that are being described. The earth is astonishingly empty, and it is jumbled in confusion, and there is darkness on the face of the deep waters. How do you get deep waters, right? The world hasn't been created yet. And it says, and the Spirit of God is hovering over the waters. There are many, many mysteries in this pasuk, and I'm not going to explore all of them, or even any of them. I just want to quote to you one medrash. The medrash says, and the world was astonishingly empty. That is the Golus of Babylon, which made the world desolate and empty by destroying the Beis HaMikdash. Vayu, confusion and jumbled. That's Persia, because the Megillah says that when Haman promulgated a decree in the name of the king that all the Jews will be killed, Ha'ir Shushan, even the Goyim in the city, the whole city of Shushan, Nevocha means confused. They didn't know what's going on here. Haman wants to wipe out a whole nation because one guy didn't bow down to him. So, Tayu, desolate, empty, is Babylon. Confusion is Persia. Darkness is Greece. And the depths of the deep waters is Edom, because the Golus of Edom is so much longer than any of the other Goliot. It's as if there's infinite depths, like you drop a pen or drop a coin down a deep well. You don't even hear it hit the bottom. And then the pasuk says, but the Spirit of God will hover over the waters. Eventually, in the merit of Torah that's compared to water, God will bring a redemption, and the next pasuk says, Vayomer Elokim Yihi Or, let there be light. In other words, the Medrash reads into the very beginning of the creation story the need of the 4 Goliot as a precursor and a preliminary for the light of Mashiach. It's a very deep idea that the struggles and the adversities and the challenges and the persecutions are all necessary for the ultimate light to come. Now the Maharal explains that there's a reason why each Golus is given that particular appellation. Emptiness or desolation is Babylon, because when Bavel destroyed the Beis HaMikdash, they, as it were, emptied the world from God's presence. The world now becomes empty, void. So Bavel is symbolic of persecution. They took away our autonomy, they took away our independence, they took away our Beis HaMikdash, they took away an element of our relationship to God. So Bavel is symptomatic of the enemy that oppresses and persecutes Jews. Persia is symbolic of the enemy that engages in genocide, right? Nebuchadnezzar killed many people, but Nebuchadnezzar did not have a coordinated effort to physically destroy the Jewish people. In fact, he didn't want to do that. He wanted them to be his slaves. In Persia is the first time that we have an active genocide against all of the people. Again, even Paro was geyser on the males, right, for a short time. So, Bavel represents the Golus of persecution. Persia represents the Golus of genocide. Yavan, Greece. This is very important because this is the Chanukah story. One has to remember that Antiochus, who was ruling from Syria, was not an anti-Semite in the model of Haman or Hitler. In fact, in a very perverse way, we can look at Antiochus as an enlightened monarch in a crazy way. Antiochus was perfectly willing to give Jews full political and civil rights as long as they assimilate, as long as they get rid of their unique ways, as long as they stop doing circumcision, stop keeping Shabbos, stop keeping kosher. In other words, the challenge of Galus Yavan was not persecution, it was assimilation. Now, if you didn't go with the plan, he would then persecute you. But keep in mind, and people don't realize this, a majority of the Jewish people became Hellenists even without his coercion. There was a fanatic group called the Maccabees or the Hashmonaim who stood up and fought. But many of the Jews were Hellenized because that was the way to go. With Hellenization, you have access to the best, well, I mean, they didn't have universities, so to speak, in those days, but the best colleges, the best jobs, the best neighborhoods. Your kids get into the best schools. Again, I'm using 21st century technology, but that's what it was. So it's a very different challenge. In fact, the Levush has a very interesting comment. On Purim, there is a chiyuv, there's an obligation to have a meal. But on Chanukah, although it's customary to have a meal, there is no chiyuv to have a seudah. Even though both holidays commemorate God giving us victory over enemies who wanted to destroy us. Why is there a chiyuv seudah on Purim and there's no chiyuv seudah on Chanukah? And the Levush says very beautifully, Purim was a threat to our physical existence. Haman, like Hitler later, did not care if you were a religious Jew or not a religious Jew. Haman wanted to kill anybody that was Jewish. So the threat was to my body. And when God saves my body, it's my body that has to give gratitude to God. So I eat and I drink to celebrate the greatness of God. Chanukah was not directly a threat to my body. Yeah, it turned into a war, but that's only because the Maccabees refused to give in spiritually. So it eventually turned into a threat to life which had casualties. But Antiochus' only demand was spiritual. Give up your Judaism and you're fine. The threat of Chanukah was to our keeping of the mitzvos, our keeping of the Torah, our ability to serve Hashem. There was no threat to our body if we would have gone with that agenda. Therefore, the Levush says, when the danger is to your spirit, and God redeemed you from that danger, it's not your body that thanks God, it's your spirit, and that's symbolized by lighting the candles, which represents the neshama of a person. It represents the light of Torah, the light of Hashem, and also the light of my soul, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. So we have to remember that Chanukah, although it did result in a political independence which enabled the Jews to establish an independent state under the kingdom of the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, the genesis of the war was not political. The genesis of the war was 100% religious. And this is made in the Al-Hanisim prayer, which was written very early. It was written actually right after the Chanukah story. It is contemporaneous with the victory of the Hashmonaim, that the Yiboneh had a goal not to kill the Jewish people, Lahashkicham Torasecha, to make them forget the Torah. And God gave us a victory, but that victory was not just political. You gave the many to the few, you gave the impure into the pure, you gave the evildoers into the hands of the righteous. You gave the perpetrators of corruption into the hands of those who learn and keep the Torah. And that's what Chanukah is about. Chanukah is about standing up to serve God, even if you're putting your life at risk. But it means, above all, not giving in to assimilationist pressures. So we see three different themes here. The Golus of Bavel is persecution and enslavement. The Golus of Persia is genocide. The Golus of Yavan is assimilation to the norms of a secular, or at least a non-Jewish society. So what is the Golus of Edom? The long Golus of Edom that is described as the depths that go all the way down into the deepest ocean. So the Maral says, the Golus of Edom does not have an autonomous character. The Golus of Edom is comprised of the other three in different proportions and different times. Meaning, in the long Golus of Edom, there are times and places where we are persecuted and enslaved, and that is called the Bavel of Edom. There are times in the Golus of Edom where our physical survival is jeopardized, like the Holocaust. That is called the Persia of Edom. And then there are times, which is really the predominant mode in Western civilization, where the trial and challenge that we face is not persecution and not genocide, but assimilation, whether it's intermarriage, whether it's dishonesty in business, whether it's not keeping the Torah. And that is called the Yavan Sheba Edom. So if we were to describe what is the situation of most Jews in the world today, it is actually the Golus of Yavan within the big Golus of Edom. So when Chanukah talks about defeating the Yavonim, it is actually the struggle that we're going through today. Now, again, tragically, with the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, in some places it may turn to the Persia of Edom in terms of physical survival of Jews when you have terrorism, blowing up shuls and the like. But Baruch Hashem, although those things are happening, and that's kind of a little bit of an infusion of the genocide aspect. But by and large, the bread and butter challenge that we face is the challenge of assimilation. So when you light the Chanukah candles, and that is why the Golus is called, of Yavan is called darkness, because when you don't have the Torah, you're living in a darkness, and the Torah illuminates darkness. And when one is assimilated, one does not realize what it is that they're giving up. One does not realize what they have. So Chanukah is a very, very relevant holiday. In fact, it's an interesting paradox that Chanukah is one of the mitzvahs, and it's a rabbinic mitzvah, it's not a Torah commandment, but it's a mitzvah that even very assimilated Jews will practice. In fact, the three top observances for the Jewish people are fasting on Yom Kippur, some type of Pesach Seder, maybe not the whole Haggadah, and lighting Chanukah. And circumcision is largely a fourth one as well. And it's so interesting that everybody lights Chanukah candles. But people don't always realize what Chanukah candles are. They think, oh, this is the victory of the Jews against their enemies. Or as Larry King once described the Jewish holiday cycle, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. And that's his 3 lines describing a Yom Tov. But Chanukah is very different. Chanukah was, in other words, if you're willing to assimilate, the war of Chanukah would be totally superfluous. No reason for it. And indeed, many of the Jews thought that the Hasmoneans were crazy people. Chanukah is all about being a Jew, even if everything around you says, why bother? Jewish pride, but not just ethnic pride. Jewish pride based on the Torah that Hashem gave us. And, as I mentioned last week, but I think it's worthwhile repeating, it is also a message of hope, because the Greek army under Antiochus was the most powerful military force in the world. And the Hashmonaim, the Maccabees, were small, untrained. not really skilled in the art of warfare. And they could have thought, what's the point? But what do you see? You do what you can. And then Hashem blesses your efforts with victory. And that is ultimately the symbol of the oil as well. Because the oil only can last one day. So you might figure, what's the point of lighting it? It's going to burn out tomorrow anyway. But what's the lesson? You do what you can. And Hashem blesses your efforts. The world is filled with darkness. There is darkness all over the place. But you do what you can to bring light to the world. Lubavitcher Rebbe often spoke about this, and it's a beautiful metaphor. He said a Jew has to be a lamplighter. What's a lamplighter? In the olden days before electricity, in the 19th century, there were gas lamps. And they had to be lit every night. So there would be a guy with a long pole with some fire at the tip of a torch at the tip of the pole, and his job was to go from lamp to lamp to ignite the lamp so there would be light in the streets. He brought light into the darkness. That is a Jew's role. The world is filled with darkness, the darkness of ignorance, assimilation, the darkness of war, violence, hate, the darkness of depression and sadness and family breakdowns. And I'm just one person. We're just one person, each of us. And we often wonder, what type of light can I bring to the world? Whatever I do is going to be so small, so inconsequential. It's not going to make a difference. But what does Chanukah say? You light that little jar of oil that only lasts one day, and somehow it keeps on burning. Don't give up. Have hope. In other words, this is also the war. The war against Yavin was also that way. It is hope based on your faith in Hashem and based on your faith in yourself that Hashem will give you the wherewithal to do what you need to do. So this is very powerful, very moving, and very relevant to the situations that we face. We face a world of darkness. And Chanukah says, light the light that you can, and you will defeat that darkness, even if it doesn't look logical. That's what the Hashmonaim did in their war, and that's what Hashem did with the miracle of the Neiros. Let me mention one other aspect of light and darkness that is actually from last week's Parsha, but it's connected to Chanukah, so I'm going to say it. I did not mention this last week. If you remember, Yaakov Avinu, the night before he meets Esav, is struggling with a mysterious man. Now it says man. Chazal tell us that this man is none other than the guardian angel of Esav. That somehow, before Yaakov meets Esav in the flesh, he has to meet Esav in the spirit. And last week we spoke about one explanation of that, but I want to mention another aspect. The morning breaks, and Yaakov is victorious, although he's limping. And Yaakov has the mysterious man in a wrestling hold. Again, the Rambam has a whole problem. How do you wrestle an angel? Angels are not physical beings. Okay. The Rambam learns it was a dream, whatever it is. Ramban says if it was a dream, why is he limping? So the Ralbag says auto-suggestion, things that happen in your dream can affect your body. Okay, that's a separate question. But Yaakov asks the angel, tell me your name. And the angel says, Lama zeh tishal lishmi. Why are you asking my name? Now, what does it mean, why are you asking my name? So I'll give you two pshatim. Rashi says, I don't have a single name. My name depends on my job. And Hashem gives me a different mission every time. And every time I have a mission, I get a new name based on my mission. So you can't really ask me what my name is because my name will change from task to task. That's how Rashi learns. Ramban says that the angel is saying, why do you need to know my name? I'm not the thing you pray to. You don't pray to me. I can't directly help you. You pray to Hashem. So you don't need to know who I am because my identity is not important because I'm not the one that helps you or hinders you. I am just a messenger of God. Now, the common denominator between Rashi and Ramban is that the angel is not answering the question. Yaakov says, what's your name? And the angel says, I'm not telling. Either because I have many names, or because my name is not relevant. But there's a pshat from a great Musar, Baal Musar, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Chasman, who says that why are you asking my name is actually the angel's name. And he is answering Yaakov's question. Yaakov says, tell me your name. And the angel says, my name is, quote, why are you asking my name? That is my name. Now, those of you might recall the very famous Abbott and Costello skit, Who's on First? It's a very famous classic comedy. Maybe the younger folks never heard of it, but maybe you did. In which, the who's on first? Who? Well, I'm asking you, but who is the guy? The guy's on first. His name is Sue, right? So, what type of name is it? Why are you asking my name? So, Rabbi Leib Chasman gives a beautiful mashal, which also talks about light and darkness. He says there was a Polish peasant who was from the boondocks in Poland. He had never been to a big city. He lived a very primitive life. And one day he comes to the big city, and he goes to a fair, and he sees electric lights, and he sees all sorts of amazing things. And he buys a flashlight. He can carry this light with him. It's like a candle that doesn't go out. And then somebody tells him, hey, see that building over there? If you buy a ticket, buy this piece of paper, and go into the building. You'll sit and you'll see people and animals coming out of the wall like it's magic. It was a theater, a motion picture theater. He had never heard of a movie, so they just told him, come in and you'll see people and animals coming out of the wall. So he buys the ticket, he takes a seat in the theater, the lights go out, he doesn't know why it's dark, and all of a sudden, a wall seems to have light being generated, and people and animals, horses, come out of the wall. And he thinks it's real. And it doesn't make sense to him, because when he walked by that wall, there were no doorways or windows. How did they get in? Where's the secret entrance? So he pulled out his big flashlight, and he shone it on the wall to see if there's a door in the wall. But of course, what happens is when you shine a flashlight on a motion picture, at least the old projectors, you don't see the picture anymore. Right? The picture is gone. It's blocked out by the light. So people were screaming at him, and they said, hey, you idiot, shut your light down, shut off your flashlight. We can only see the picture when it's dark. When the lights are on, we do not see the picture. Rabbi Leib Chasman said, this is a mashal for Olam Hazeh. This world is a world of darkness. We don't really connect to Hashem. We don't really think of Hashem. In darkness, all sorts of things look real that are not really real. Power, money, hedonism, gratification, grudges, resentments. We think of them as so real and so important. But they're like the motion picture people that are not really there. But because it's dark, you think all sorts of things are real, which are not really there. And the other side of the coin, when you sit in darkness, you can have a bag of diamonds next to you, and you're not going to notice it. So darkness has two consequences. You see things that look real, which are not, and you don't see the things that are real. When you turn on the lights, these consequences are reversed. The things that are not real disappear, and the things that are real you see and appreciate. Rabbi Leib Chasman said, this distinction between light and darkness is not just physical. It's manifest in the spiritual realm. When I live in darkness, when I sleepwalk through life, when I don't think about the purpose of existence, all sorts of things look so real and important. But when I have the light of the Torah, then I appreciate what is really important in life and what is an illusion. So now let's go back to the angel. When Yaakov asked the angel, "What is your name?" Now this angel is the angel of Esav, but symbolically the angel also represents the Yetzer Hara, the powers of impurity, the Satan. And when Yaakov says, "What is your name?" Yaakov is asking, "What is your power?" This is a very important Kabbalistic idea. The Arizal writes that the name of a person represents the root of his soul and his spiritual power. That's why the Arizal says the name that parents give a child at a bris, even if they think they're naming him after Uncle Charlie or whatever it would be, is actually a prophecy that God has put into their minds to identify the source of the child's spiritual neshama. And this would be equally true if a ger, one who converts to Judaism, chooses their own name. It's a very significant point. God put into your mind what you are. Now, unfortunately, because we're so ignorant about this, we don't really understand, for example, what is the difference between the neshama of David and the neshama of Moshe. We don't really understand that. We know there were different tzaddikim and the like, but we don't really fully identify the root of a soul. But every soul has a root, which actually means, interestingly enough, that's why all souls are ultimately one, because we're all rooted in the totality of divinity. So I'm rooted in the same lahabdil soil as you're rooted in, but we get different aspects of godliness. And our name is an identification of our spiritual power. Okay, in fact, ad kedei kach, that I remember once being at a bris, and the baby's supposed to be named, and the grandfather who was naming the baby didn't like the name that his daughter had chosen, so he just changed the name after his father or something like that. And I still remember, I didn't know what was going on, but I still remember from the other side of the mechitza hearing this wail, "No!" And they actually asked Rosh Hashiva that was there, it was Rav Yaakov Weinberg Zatzal, Rav Noach Weinberg's brother, my own Rosh Hashiva, the Rosh Hashiva of Ner Yisrael, and they say, "Hey, this grandfather didn't name the right name. Can we go back to what the mother wanted?" And he actually said no. He says, if this is what happened, this was God's will, that the child have this name. Now, you could argue, again, in terms of actual halacha, ask your local Orthodox rabbi. Some would say, hey, it's one thing that if the parents gave a name, that's his name, you don't change it unless you're sick or something. But here, this was an unauthorized change, so to speak. Okay, so I'm not addressing that particular shaila, but it does highlight in a dramatic way how important the name is. So now, let's go back to Yaakov. When Yaakov says to the angel, "Tell me your name," he's asking the angel, what is your power over people? How do you trick people into doing sins? If you think about it, Averos make no sense, because whatever benefit or pleasure you get from an Avera is going to be greatly outweighed by the negative consequences. And whatever inconvenience a mitzvah gives you is going to be infinitely outweighed by the reward and the connection with God. So, from a simple calculation, it makes no sense to not keep the Torah. Now, again, I'm not talking about people who are not convinced about the Torah. I'm talking about, let's say, people like us. We believe in the Torah, we believe in the mitzvahs, but we do averos. Yaakov is asking this angel, what's your trick? How do you get people to go off the derech? That's what's your name, meaning what's your power? Answer, my power is I get people not to ask who I am, meaning not to think. My power is I convince people, don't bother thinking about this, just enjoy the moment. In other words, my power is don't turn on the lights. Don't think. And when you don't think, life can go off in many, many directions. You simply don't think about it. Be oblivious. Sleepwalk. So, once again, Chanukah, which is all about bringing light into darkness, is turning on the lights so you perceive true reality. You perceive what life is about. You know, life is relatively short. Again, when you're young, you don't necessarily have that awareness. But life is short. And indeed, you know, the Gemara has a famous statement that a certain rabbi was asked for advice from his students, what they should do. So he says, I got perfect advice for you. Do tshuva one day before you die. And they said, what is that? He says, yeah, you don't know. So the answer is, every day, do tshuva. And there is a concept, now we don't like to talk about it so much, remembering the day of death. Now, let me point out, this is not to make you depressed, this is not to make you anxious, this is not to take away simcha. David HaMelech says, Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. Right, the famous song from Rav Nachman of Breslov, Mitzvah Gedola, Lios b'simcha. It's a great mitzvah to be in simcha. A Jew should be joyous. We're not talking about being depressed. We're not talking about being anxious. But when you have an awareness that life is not forever, you cherish every moment. Carpe diem. Seize the moment. Seize the day. Right? Don't put off tomorrow. Right? You have grudges and grievances with people. Pick up the phone. Again, I know we talk about this a lot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, but you know, sometimes people make a big mistake. They think, oh, all right, Baruch Hashem, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, that's the tshuva season. Now that we're past that, I can put tshuva on the back burner. No, no, no. Every day, we got to try to improve ourselves. We got to try to bring light to the world. We got to try to bring light to our own lives and not sleepwalk. And that, I think, is yet another message of Chanukah that you have to think about as well. Turn on the lights and see the purpose of life. And then your life will have meaning. It will have integrity. It will be taking you to a certain place. Now again, let me emphasize the obvious. In a life that is purposeful and intentional and thought out, there is room for recreation, for pleasure, for enjoyment. We're not talking about that, gee, every time, you know, I take a walk or go to the park or buy an ice cream cone, I'm doing some tremendous sin. No. Within the context of an Eved Hashem, there is room to enjoy the pleasures of the world, because that relaxes you, that gives you serenity, that can give you calmness, and that in turn helps you in your avodas Hashem. But the point is, everything we do should be directed towards the purpose. Does this bring me closer to God? Or does it not? And there's no neutral, because if it doesn't bring you closer to God, you don't just remain in place, it pushes you further from God. And this is called the purpose-driven life. Actually, it's the name of a famous Christian book. I'm just appropriating the title, and I think the title is a good message. The purpose-driven life, that every decision should be made based on a purpose. Does it advance my purpose? And as I say, that does not mean you have to be an ascetic. It does not mean you have to be a hermit. But everything should come together and create that holistic, structural integrity. So that's kind of the other message of Chanukah that I wanted to share with you. Now, an interesting thing, I'm going to talk a little bit of history at this point. The mitzvahs of Chanukah are discussed in very, very fragmentary fashion in the Mishnah. The Mishnah, which was authored by Rav Yehuda HaNasi in around the year 200, and that is around 300 years after the Chanukah story. And this is after the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, and after the Bar Kokhba revolt even. Chanukah is virtually not discussed in the Mishnah at all. And even in the Gemara, the story of Chanukah only takes up around 3 dafim. Now it's an interesting question. The paucity of coverage of Chanukah is a little bit perplexing. There's a whole tractate of Mishnah and Gemara in both the Bavli and the Yerushalmi about Purim. Purim as a whole Masechta. Chanukah is not even mentioned. Well, it's mentioned like very, very briefly in the Mishnah and discussed in 2 or 3 pages. Why is Chanukah so de-emphasized in Chazal? And there are actually a few reasons for this. Reason number 1 is Chanukah was a bit of a dangerous, subversive holiday when the Jews were under Roman occupation. Because let's imagine I'm lighting candles outside, like we do in Yerushalayim, and some Roman walks by and says, "What are those candles for?" And you say, "Oh, we are commemorating the overthrow of a foreign power that was occupying Eretz Yisrael." Not so good. It's almost a call to rebellion. So Chanukah was not a politically correct holiday in the time of the Roman Empire. And that's actually the meaning of the statement in the Gemara that otherwise you wouldn't understand. It says, the mitzvah of Chanukah is to light the menorah outside, so people will see it. But if it's dangerous, bring it inside. Now, why would it be dangerous? I mean, for carrots, it's more dangerous to light inside than outside. The answer is dangerous, meaning if the Romans might be antagonized by it. Okay? So that's reason number 1. Reason number 2, the Chassam Sofer says, is that after the Hashmonaim defeated the Greeks and they established an independent Jewish state, they made themselves kings. This was the Hasmonean kingdom. Ramban writes in Parshas Vayechi that was a very serious sin. Because although the Maccabees were righteous, holy, tzaddikim, they should not have assumed the monarchy after their victory, because the monarchy of the Jewish people was given to the tribe of Yehuda, and in particular the seed of David HaMelech, and it was a sin for the Hasmoneans to assume Malchus, and that is why, in the course of time, they became wiped out. Ad Kedei Kach, the Gemara says that anyone who claims to be of Hasmonean descent is a slave, because only their slaves survived. Now, Rav Yehuda HaNasi, who is the author of the Mishnah, himself is a descendant of David HaMelech. So he didn't want to glorify the Chashmonaim to such a degree, because their Malchus was a sinful taking away of what rightfully belonged to his family. Again, it wasn't a personal grudge, it was a sin, and that's why he de-emphasized it. That's what the Chassam Sofer says. But I want to give you a third reason. And the third reason is, by the time the Mishnah was written, and the Jews are now under Roman occupation, and the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, and the Bar Kokhba revolt decimated hundreds of thousands of Jews, killed them. In retrospect, the whole story of Chanukah represented a failed revolution. It was a failed revolution in several ways. First of all, politically it was failed, because the Malchus that was established for over 100 years was simply destroyed by the Romans. So politically, Malchus Chashmonai had no kiyum, and in fact, even as I just said, even the descendants weren't around. But more importantly, spiritually, the Hasmonean revolution turned into a failure. Some of you may have read the book Animal Farm by George Orwell. And Animal Farm is a parody of the Russian Revolution of 1917, in which the animals are being oppressed by a human farmer. The animals revolt and overthrow the human domination. The animals create their own governments. And what eventually happens is that some of the animals become dictators who are even worse than the humans that they overthrew. Orwell's point is fairly transparent. We had this Russian Revolution to overthrow the czars in the interest of freedom, equality. Even communism was the banner of freedom, to each according to their needs, from each according to their abilities, equality. And what did you get as a result of the communist revolution? You got a Lenin, you got a Stalin. I can tell you Stalin was not more benign than the worst Tsar. And in truth, Judaism did a lot better under the Tsars than it did under Stalin. The great Gedolim of Achronim were under the Tsars. Under Stalin, Yiddishkeit was almost totally eradicated, except for the courage of Chabad, which continued to operate in Russia. That's why most of the so-called Jews who come to Israel may halachically not even be Jewish, because for 70 years they knew they were Jewish, or they came from Jews, because their passports said Yid. But there were no rabbis, no teachers, no Torah. So intermarriage was total. And as a result, the children were largely not Jewish, at least if the women were not Jewish, and the like. So what is Orwell's lesson? Orwell's lesson is that it's often the case that the revolutionaries become the very enemy that they try to overthrow. This happened with the Hashmonaim. What were the Hashmonaim fighting? They were fighting Hellenism, they were fighting assimilation, they were fighting the infusion of Greek culture that undermined Torah. And what did they become? Not the first generations, but the later generations. They became Hellenists. They became assimilated. They became persecutors of the Chachamim. They killed many of the great rabbis. So Rav Yehuda HaNasi, writing hundreds of years later, is basically thinking, what exactly is there to glorify here? This glorious revolution to establish the primacy of Torah became themselves the primary advocates of Hellenism and Sadducee, the Tzdukim. And that is why I always want to point out historically, this is an interesting observation, that there's Chanukah version 1 and Chanukah version 2. Chanukah version 1, if you look in the book of the Maccabees, was primarily a celebration of the military victory that established the Hasmonean state, and that is reflected in the Al Hanisim prayer. Because at the time, that was a wonderful victory that reestablished Torah. But by the time the Mishnah and Gemara were written, the element of victory was de-emphasized. And instead we focused on the miracle of the jar of oil. And that kind of people ask the question, how come the Al Hanisim emphasizes the military victory, but we seem to emphasize the miracle of the oil that burnt for 8 days? I would suggest that there's Chanukah version 1, Chanukah version 2. And that is, when it became apparent that the military victory was a failure. I don't just mean because of military, I mean the religious principle turned out not to have a kiyum, not to have an endurance. So we focused on a different aspect of Chanukah, the miracle of the oil. Okay? But nevertheless, as I say, the general lessons are still very important. The capacity of light to dispel darkness. The idea of hope even when the odds seem impossible. Turning on the lights and understanding inner reality. These are fundamental lessons that we take into our lives. So I want to wish everybody a wonderful Chanukah. I guess next week will still be Chanukah, so I guess we'll oh no, next week no shir. Okay. So this is my one Chanukah shir, and I wish everyone that the Chanukah should be a time of light, a time of joy, a time of commitment, a time of dedication, and a time of confronting the reality of our lives, to understand what is real and what is fake, what is enduring and what is transient. And by turning on the lights, we will both understand those aspects of our lives that are not real, and more importantly, we will see those aspects of our existence that are true and enduring. So, Chanukah Sameach.